The HOA president stood on my porch waving a cease and desist letter and told me my flagpole was going to bankrupt me. 6 weeks later, standing in a folding chair in the clubhouse, watching the vote count climb, he couldn't even look at me. 214 to 12. That's not a disagreement, that's a landslide, and it started over a 20-foot pole in my front yard. My name doesn't matter for this story, so let's just say I'm the guy at 4 Larkspur Court in Cedar Hollow Estates. A subdivision of about 240 homes built in the late 90s, the kind of place with matching mailboxes, mowed medians, and a homeowners association that mostly stayed out of everyone's business. I bought my house 3 years ago, a modest 4-bedroom with a detached garage and a yard just big enough for my dog to embarrass himself in. My father was a Marine for 22 years, and when he passed, the one thing he asked was that somebody keep flying the flag he raised every single morning of his adult life. So I put in a flagpole. 20 feet, aluminum, in-ground sleeve, installed by a licensed contractor permitted through the county. And this part matters, fully compliant with the HOA's existing architectural guidelines at the time, which allowed flagpoles up to 22 feet with no prior approval required. For 2.5 years, nobody said a word. Neighbors waved. Kids on the block used it as a landmark, meet at the house with the flag. The HOA newsletter even ran a photo of it during a 4th of July feature. I paid my dues on time, mowed on schedule, kept my hedges trimmed to the regulation height nobody actually measures. I was, by any reasonable standard, a model homeowner. Then in March, our HOA board flipped almost entirely in the annual election, and a man named Gary Thornton became president. Gary had lived in Cedar Hollow for 11 years in a house 2 streets over, and he ran his campaign on restoring order and property values. His flyers, glossy and expensive-looking for a volunteer HOA race, promised consistent enforcement and protecting what we built here. I didn't think much of it at the time. Every HOA has someone who wants to feel important, who treats a 5-person volunteer board like a city council. I even voted for one of the other candidates on his slate, a woman who talked about pothole repairs and pool maintenance schedules, normal, boring, harmless things. What I didn't know yet was that Gary had a very specific idea of what order meant, and that idea happened to start with my front yard. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday in April. I got home from work to find a bright yellow notice taped to my door. Violation notice. It read, unauthorized structure, flagpole exceeds proposed height restriction. Proposed, not approved, not voted on, proposed. The notice cited a new 15-foot maximum height for flagpoles, effective immediately, and gave me 30 days to comply or face a fine of $150 per week. I want you to sit with that for a second. A rule that didn't exist yet being enforced immediately against a structure that had been standing, permitted, and approved for 2.5 years. I called the HOA management office the next morning. The woman on the phone sounded almost apologetic. The board passed an emergency amendment, she said. It went into effect at the last meeting. I asked when that meeting was. She said March 28th. I asked how many homeowners were notified in advance. There was a pause. I believe it was posted on the community bulletin board, she said, the bulletin board inside the clubhouse, which requires a key fob most residents never use. That Thursday, Gary Thornton knocked on my door himself. He was maybe 55, silver hair, golf shirt tucked into khakis a little too tightly, holding a clipboard like it was a badge. I wanted to handle this personally, he said, since your poll is really the reason we drafted the amendment. I asked him to repeat that. He did without blinking. My flagpole, the one that had been there for years without a single complaint, was apparently the specific inspiration for a rule designed to force me to cut it down. Some residents feel it's excessive, Gary said, draws too much attention. This is a residential community, not a VFW hall. I told him my father was a Marine and the flag flew for him. Gary's face did something complicated, somewhere between discomfort and irritation, and he said, I understand that's meaningful to you, but rules are rules and the board has to think about the whole neighborhood. Then he handed me a second notice. This one wasn't a warning. It was a formal violation citation, backdated to the day of the emergency amendment, with an accumulating fine already at $450. I stood in my own doorway holding a bill for flying my father's flag. I asked Gary directly whether the amendment had gone to a community vote. He shifted the clipboard to his other arm and said the board had full authority to update architectural standards as needed. I asked how many homeowners had voted on it. He said the board itself had voted unanimously at the March meeting. I asked how many people that was. 5, he admitted, after a pause that told me he already knew how that number would sound out loud. 5 people in a room most of the neighborhood didn't even know was meeting had decided my father's flag needed to come down within 30 days or start costing me real money. I tried reason first, because that's what you do when you still believe the system is basically fair. I emailed the board that same night laying out the timeline. Flagpole installed and approved 3 years earlier, no complaints on record, amendment passed with no advance notice to homeowners, fine already accruing before the 30-day compliance window had even closed. I asked politely for the amendment to be paused pending review. I got a 2-line reply from the property management company 2 days later. The board stands by its decision. Please contact us to discuss compliance options. Compliance options. Like there was a version of this where I quietly agreed my father's flag was the problem. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept replaying the phrase, "Your poll is really the reason we drafted the amendment." An HOA board isn't supposed to write a rule targeting one specific homeowner's already approved property. Even I knew that sounded wrong, but I needed more than a gut feeling. So I did what apparently nobody on that board expected a model homeowner to do. I requested the full governing documents, the declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the bylaws, and every board meeting minute from the last 2 years, through a formal written records request, citing the association's own disclosure policy. It took the management company 9 days to comply, which itself violated their own 5-business-day policy. But when the documents finally landed in my inbox, I read every page twice. And there it was, buried in Article 9, Section 4 of the CC and RS. Any amendment altering architectural standards required a vote of no less than 67% of homeowners in good standing, conducted with a minimum of 30 days written notice mailed to every household. Not a bulletin board posting. Not an emergency board vote of 5 people in a clubhouse on a Tuesday night, a community-wide mailed 30-day vote. Gary Thornton's board hadn't followed their own rulebook. They'd invented a shortcut and they'd aimed it directly at me. I called Gary and asked him calmly to walk me through the amendment process the board had followed. He got defensive fast. "The board has emergency authority for time-sensitive matters," he said. I asked him to point me to the section of the CC and RS that defined emergency authority. Long pause. "I'd have to check with our attorney," he said. I told him I already had the document open in front of me and Article 9 didn't mention emergency authority anywhere. He hung up. 3 days later, the fine had climbed to $600, and a certified letter arrived from a law firm representing the HOA. It didn't just threaten fines anymore. It threatened a lien against my property, and if the structure wasn't removed within 14 days, legal action to compel removal at my expense, plus recovery of the association's legal fees. 14 days to cut down the flagpole. My father asked me to keep flying or start losing my house one fine at a time. That letter is what changed everything for me. Up until then, I'd been playing defense, hoping reasonable conversation would fix an unreasonable situation. Reading the words "lien against your property" in the same paragraph as your flagpole made something in me go very, very calm. Not scared calm, focused calm. If Gary Thornton wanted to fight this with paperwork, I was going to bury him in it. I spent that weekend at my kitchen table with 3 things: the CC and RS, a highlighter, and my laptop. First, I confirmed the 67% vote requirement in black and white, photographed and saved. Second, I researched federal and state protections. And found something Gary clearly hadn't considered: the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, along with my state's own statute prohibiting homeowners associations from banning or unreasonably restricting the display of a United States flag on a homeowner's property. With narrow exceptions for size and placement that my 20-foot pole didn't come close to violating. Third, I pulled the association's own architectural approval records from 3 years earlier. The original permit application for my flagpole, signed and stamped approved by the board that existed at the time, dated the 14th of June. I made copies of everything. Then I did the thing that actually mattered. I stopped keeping this to myself. I printed a 1-page summary, plain language, no legal jargon. The board passed a rule targeting one household without the required community vote, in likely violation of both the CC and RS and state flag protection law, and was now threatening a lien over it. I put it in 40 mailboxes on my block myself, on a Saturday morning in the rain, because I wasn't waiting for the HOA newsletter to get around to it. By Monday, my phone would not stop buzzing. Turns out I wasn't the only person Gary Thornton's board had quietly steamrolled that spring. One neighbor had been fined for a shed that had stood, permitted, since before Gary was even on the board. Another had been told her wheelchair ramp violated uniform exterior guidelines. A third had simply stopped attending meetings because, in her words, it always feels like the outcome's already decided before anyone gets a chance to speak. What had looked like isolated annoyances suddenly looked like a pattern, and my flagpole notice had accidentally handed everyone the paper trail to prove it. I requested in writing that the board place an item on the next meeting agenda, a homeowner-initiated referendum under Article 12 of the bylaws, which allowed any petition signed by at least 10% of homeowners to force a binding community vote on a board decision. I needed 24 signatures. I had 31 by Wednesday and 63 by Friday. I hand-delivered the petition to the management office with a return receipt because I had learned my lesson about trusting a bulletin board. The board tried to slow-walk it. The management company claimed the petition needed legal review, which conveniently took another 11 days, during which my fines kept ticking upward toward the point where a lien became a real, immediate threat. So I called the county's Community Association Ombudsman Office, described the 67% bypass and the retroactive targeting of an already approved structure, and asked whether that fell under their jurisdiction. It did. A formal complaint got logged with a case number, and more usefully, a very official-looking letter got sent to the HOA's registered agent requesting a response within 15 business days. Legal review of my petition suddenly took 2 days instead of 11. The special meeting was set for a Thursday night in the clubhouse, the same room where 5 people had quietly voted my father's flag off my property 8 weeks earlier. This time it wasn't 5 people. It was standing room only, folding chairs lined the hallway. Someone had to prop the fire doors open just to fit everyone who showed up. Gary opened the meeting trying to control the narrative, calling it an unfortunate but necessary conversation about community standards, and reminding everyone that the board acted in what we believed were the best interests of the neighborhood. I let him finish. Then I stood up, holding my folder, and asked to read 3 documents into the record. The original approved flagpole permit dated 3 years earlier, the CC and RS section requiring a 67% community vote for architectural amendments, and the state statute protecting flag display on residential property. I read them slowly. I didn't editorialize. I didn't need to. The room did that part for me. I could hear the murmurs building with every paragraph. Gary tried to interrupt twice, both times reaching for the same phrase, "The board has discretion," and both times a different homeowner cut him off from the crowd, not me, homeowners I'd never even met, people who'd apparently had their own quiet run-ins with that same word, discretion. A man near the back stood up and simply said, "You fined my mother $800 for a mailbox post 2 inches too tall. Don't talk to us about discretion." "Discretion isn't a rule," I said back to him, still standing. "It's what you call it when you skip the rule." A few people laughed, not cruelly, just the kind of laugh that happens when somebody finally says the thing everyone's been thinking. Gary looked at the property manager like she might rescue him. She didn't. The property manager, visibly uncomfortable, finally confirmed on the record that the emergency amendment had never gone through the required community-wide mailed vote. Gary's own board attorney, sitting quietly in the corner, leaned over and whispered something in his ear that made his shoulders drop about 2 inches. I found out later it was simple advice: stop talking. The referendum vote was called right there, as the bylaws required once a valid petition forced the issue. Ballots went out with a 14-day window, mailed to every household exactly the way the rulebook demanded from the start. I spent those 2 weeks doing nothing dramatic. I answered questions when neighbors knocked. I kept my flag flying, obviously, fine notices and all, because I wasn't taking it down for a rule that never lawfully existed. I mowed my lawn. I waited. The results were read aloud at the next open meeting, on a Tuesday in June, almost exactly 3 months after that first yellow notice appeared on my door. 226 ballots returned out of 240 households, itself a record turnout the management company said they'd never seen. 214 votes to rescind the flagpole amendment entirely, 12 votes to keep it. The room didn't erupt in cheering. It was quieter than that, more like a long exhale everyone had been holding since March. But when the number was announced, my elderly neighbor from 3 doors down reached over and squeezed my shoulder without saying a word, and that meant more than any applause could have. Gary Thornton didn't run for re-election that fall. He didn't even show up to hand off the board binder. He mailed it. The new board's first official act, unanimous 5 votes to 0, was to rescind every fine attached to my address, reverse the 2 other disputed violations from that spring. and formally amend the architectural guidelines to explicitly protect flag displays consistent with state law so no future board could try this shortcut again. My $600 fine disappeared from the books. The lien threat evaporated like it was never real, because legally it never was. A few weeks later, the neighbor whose ramp had been flagged for violating uniform exterior guidelines stopped by with a plate of cookies of all things, and told me she'd already forgotten what it felt like to bring a complaint to a board and actually be believed. The shed neighbor got his fine reversed too, backdated, with a formal letter of apology from the new board that Gary's old board would never have written in 100 years. None of that happened because I was special or because I hired some expensive lawyer. It happened because a rulebook nobody bothered to read carefully enough finally got read carefully, by someone who had a good enough reason to sit at a kitchen table on a Saturday and do it. I still raise that flag every morning, same as my father did for 22 years, same as I have for 3 years now. It catches the light over the same porch, the same yard, the same street where, for one stretch of an ugly spring, a man with a clipboard decided one homeowner's grief and pride were negotiable line items in his personal vision of order. They weren't. And 214 of my neighbors made sure everyone knew it. If there's a lesson in this, it's not really about flagpoles. It's that most of these fights get won in the paperwork, not the shouting. Read your governing documents, know your state's protections. And don't assume a board with a clipboard and a bulletin board notice speaks for your whole street, because more often than you'd think, it doesn't even come close. If this story hit home, you already know what it feels like to be told the rules only apply to some people. Drop a comment and tell me if your HOAs ever pulled something like this. I read every single one. And if you want more of these, the real fights, the paper trails, the moments the vote finally comes back, stick around, because there's a lot more of this neighborhood's history worth telling.